Welcome everyone, my name is Brendan Snyder. Thank you for joining me. This is Classic Album Review. We are going to take a look today at Jim Steinman's one and only solo album, Bad for Good, which came out in 1981. And so with the recent passing of Jim Steinman, I broke out his catalog, which is quite extensive. He's worked with so many different artists. Of course, he is most well known for having worked on the Meat Loaf album, Bat Out of Hell, in 1977, and it really is both a Meat Loaf and Jim Steinman album, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But he's really so much more than that. He is a composer, a lyricist, producer, a playwright, arranger, pianist, and singer. And I think all of that is displayed in spades on this album here, Bad for Good. As I said, that came out in 1981, his one and only solo album. We're going to take a look at that, but before we do, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please click the button. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And if you enjoy the video, please share it, help get the word out that way, share it on social media and things of that nature. I would appreciate that. And of course, by subscribing, you'll be able to stay up to date on all that's going on in the world of music, just like this with Jim Steinman's Bad for Good 1981 solo album that we are going to talk about here. And so, you know, he began his career in musical theater, which would play a big part in his later musical stylings of things. And of course, he rose to prominence in 1977 along with Meat Loaf for the Bat Out of Hell album that they put out together. And while Meat Loaf would actually receive top billing on the album itself, the album is every bit as much a Jim Steinman album, especially in the sense that he wrote the songs and the music and everything for it. And while he didn't receive a production credit for it, it's actually produced by Todd Rundgren. He really did and was involved within that for the album. And ultimately, the album itself would become one of the biggest selling albums of all time. It would sell over 14 million copies in the US alone, with estimated sales of around 40 million worldwide. And so while out on the road supporting the album itself, Jim and Meat Loaf, of course, are both out on the road doing that, the record label actually pulled Jim Steinman off the road. They wanted him to begin writing the follow-up album to Bat Out of Hell. Unfortunately, though, Meat Loaf would develop vocal issues and be sidelined for several years, and the label, not wanting to lose momentum, they asked Jim Steinman to actually record the songs that he had been writing as the follow-up to Bat Out of Hell, and those would then become his solo album, Bad for Good. So this album here is really what was intended as the follow-up to Bat Out of Hell. And if you want to know what was or should have come out in quick succession, this is the album. And this is part of the reason why I say that this album here is every bit as good as Bat Out of Hell or the follow-up, Dead Ringer. And we're going to get into that now with it, talking about this, as the album itself features 10 songs. And it's 62 minutes long, which was a really long album for 1981. It's even a long album for today. Now, Jim Steinman performs most of the male lead vocals on here, but 3 of the tracks actually feature Canadian male lead vocalist Rory Dodd, who does a great job. And then, of course, the female lead vocals on here are performed by Carla DeVito. Now, as I mentioned before, the Bat Out of Hell album features Todd Rundgren in production on it, and so does this album here, along with this time Jim Steinman actually getting a co-production credit for it. So effectively recreating the Bat Out of Hell team for this album. Unfortunately, though, this album did not sell anywhere near as much as Bat Out of Hell did. And at the time, the reviews for the album would say things such as Steinman's vocals were inadequate, and I have to completely disagree with that. I think the album has the right amount of reserve in the vocals. It actually allows the over-the-top music and production of it to ascend in ways that it might not if the vocals themselves had been more defined. I think it makes the album feel bigger and larger than life. It also allows Jim's unique lyrical stylings and song structure to really take the listener on a journey and not get caught up in other aspects such as the lead vocal itself. And musically and production-wise on this album, as I said, I think it is every bit as good as the Bat Out of Hell album or the follow-up Dead Ringer. There's really quite a number of standout tracks on here. Case in point, just shown by how many other other artists have actually covered those songs, including Meat Loaf. The original versions of classic songs such as Lost Boys and Golden Girls, Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire, or Rock and Roll Dreams Come Through, all of which would later turn up on Bat Out of Hell 2 from 1993, which would go on to become the biggest selling album that year. It sold 5 million copies in the US alone and 15 million copies around the world. But I would say one of my favorite tracks off of this album is, in fact, The Storm. It's actually a song, though, that's performed by the New York Philharmonic, but the huge epic score that is created on here allows for this crescendo to happen. The Storm is track number 9, and remember I mentioned there are 10 tracks on here. So it creates this crescendo right before the last track, which is Rock and Roll Dreams Come Through, which personally I think is a far better version than the later version that turned up on Meat Loaf's 1993 album. While this version on here by Jim Steinman is more subdued, I actually think it actually allows for it to be more epic in nature because it is reserved and held back. It's just a perfect album closer in my opinion, and with the orchestral reprise that comes at the tail end of this thing, I think it creates a perfect classic album in my opinion. And so just closing things out here now, in 1981, Jim and Meat Loaf would re-team for the Dead Ringer album, which is this one here. And in 1983, Jim would produce Bonnie Tyler's Faster Than the Speed of Light, which included Total Eclipse of the Heart, which went all the way to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. And also in 83, he worked with Air Supply, and he provided them the #2 Billboard Hot 100 hit, Making Love Out of Nothing at All. And then over the years, Jim would work with a variety of musicians and a number of different soundtracks, occasionally re-teaming with Meat Loaf, sort of here and there. And while I love the Meat Loaf albums, I think Jim's solo album, Bad for Good, it will always have a special place in my collection. I think he is a highly underrated musician, and this is a highly underrated album that should have been a lot bigger than it was, simply by the fact of it being overshadowed by Meat Loaf himself and, of course, the Bat Out of Hell first album from 1977. And I hope that if nothing else, that by this review here, it shows or shines a little bit of additional light on it. And maybe if you don't know it or you're not as familiar, you will search out and go check this album out, as I think it is a worthy album to know and to have in your collection. Rest in peace, Jim. Thank you for all the great music you gave us, and your music will certainly live on in the hearts and minds of all your fans. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and if you did, please remember to comment, like, and subscribe. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know how you think of this album, what your favorite track off here is, or what your favorite Jim Steinman song is, as this video is also intended to be a tribute to the great man himself. Take care, have a great day, and I'll talk to y'all real soon. Bye, everyone.